Hello everyone. So I am usually a big fan of Kosas. I have all of the products that they are currently offering and I feel like I've done quite well with almost all of them. But last week I tried out their new foundation product, which is called BB Burst, and I did find that this product was very irritating to my skin. So that was a bit of a surprise to me, and I looked into the situation and I realized that this particular product has an ingredient in it that is kind of controversial and that a lot of clean beauty companies are putting into some of their products these days. So I thought that it would be a good idea to do a video on what I have found out and which kinds of products I will and won't be using in the future based on this new information, because it really has cleared up a lot of mysteries for me in terms of which kinds of products I can tolerate and which ones are problematic for me. So in general, I do, again, really like a lot of the Kosas products, so I thought I would do a second video where I just talk about all of the Kosas products and let you know which ones I really do like, so please watch for that video soon. So first, a little bit of information about me. I'm 59 years old and I have dry and sensitive skin, and I've never had any kind of cosmetic procedures like injections or surgery, and I don't intend to do that in the future. So I am hoping that the makeup and skincare products that I use can help me to look a little bit fresher and maybe even a little bit younger. And over the past 3 years, I have tried out more than 1,000 makeup products and 1,000 skincare products. So I do have a pretty good basis of comparison for everything that I try out. And one thing that I have found is that there are certain ingredients that are in products that do always irritate my skin. And I know that these ingredients are also problematic for many other people with sensitive skin. So I just don't talk about those kinds of products on this channel. So one of the kinds of products that I always avoid discussing on this channel are chemical sunscreens. And that is because of all of the chemical sunscreens that I have ever tried. I have always reacted poorly to all of them. Now, of course, some people may be able to tolerate some chemical sunscreens, and in addition, people may vary in terms of how concerned they are about the potential problems with sunscreens. So I am definitely not saying that I don't think that anyone should be using chemical sunscreens, but I do think that for me, it has turned out to be a better thing if I just avoid them. So this BB Burst product from Kosas is not even stated as being a sunscreen at all. It is just stated as being a foundation product that offers some skincare benefits. But if you look at the ingredient list, it has 2 sunscreen ingredients listed on the label. The first one is zinc oxide, which is listed as the first ingredient after water. And then the third ingredient after water is called Butyloctyl Salicylate, or BOS. So this is what is known as a sunscreen booster, but this is increasingly being recognized as not just helping other sunscreens to perform, but actually acting as a chemical sunscreen in the products that it's included in. So BOS is just one of a number of apparent chemical sunscreens that are being included in either sunscreen products or foundation products that supposedly include only mineral SPF. So some of the companies in the clean beauty arena that are offering products like this include Tower 28, Well People, Ilia, Ciele, and Supergoop. And all of these products that I mentioned are being sold as Clean at Sephora, and a number of them are also being sold as Credo products, even though Credo states very clearly that they do not allow any chemical sunscreens in any products that they sell. So one thing that I do wonder is why, considering the amount of sunscreen that is in this BB Burst product, that it's not actually stated as being a sunscreen. And I will come back to that and give some speculation about that. But what I do think is that when I look at the ingredient list for this product, that it likely is the BOS that has caused me issues. And that is because I've reacted really the same way to all of the products that I have used that have had BOS in them. So I became interested in the topic of sunscreen boosters last summer of 2023 when I read an article in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology, and the title of this article is Sunscreens, Misconceptions, and Misinformation. And 3 of the authors for this article are dermatologists who are associated with the Harvard Medical School. And their conclusion, as I said, is that these so-called sunscreen boosters are not just helping other ingredients in the formula to work better in terms of offering sun protection, but that they actually are offering sun protection themselves, and that it is the same kind of sun protection that chemical sunscreens are offering. And based on my having read that article and on looking up some other information on this, I do think that they're probably right about that. So the idea that BOS and these other sunscreen boosters are really just chemical sunscreens that haven't gotten FDA approval has been something that a lot of people have been talking about for quite a while, a little bit under the table. And in order to try to prove it, these researchers did a few studies where they made up their own sunscreen that only had these ingredients in it, and they did find that those sunscreens were very effective in terms of absorbing UV light of certain kinds. In addition, these sunscreens were absorbed into the skin in the same way that chemical sunscreens are absorbed. And then in terms of the structure of these chemicals, the authors state that the molecular structure of Butyloctyl Salicylate is virtually identical to the FDA-approved chemical filter octisalate, and then Ethy Ferulate, which is another sunscreen booster that they studied, is a chemical analog of the FDA-approved chemical filter octinoxate. And I believe that a chemical analog is a chemical that's similar to, but not identical to, another chemical. So although I have sensitive skin in general, I have found that chemical sunscreens tend to be really more irritating than pretty much anything else that I have used, and that this has been the case for me ever since I was a little kid. And it does seem to be the case that chemical sunscreens are among the most irritating ingredients for other people as well. Now, I'm not saying that everyone is irritated by these ingredients, of course, but I do think that there are a lot of people that are not aware that chemical sunscreens are causing them irritation, and so they're attributing their other skin issues such as acne or red skin or eczema or other things like this to something else, such as something innate or something else that could be bothering them, and not realizing that sunscreens are actually a cause of that. And I think that the reason for that is that these are ingredients that tend to build up over time in terms of the amount of irritation that they cause, and because a lot of people are really using sunscreens as they think that they're supposed to on a daily basis and never giving their skin a break from them. And if that is the case, then if the irritation is built up over the time, then they may not be aware of it. So I think it's probably a good idea as a start for anyone who does have skin issues of whatever kind to give themselves a break from everything that is suspicious that they think could be causing an issue from time to time, and for a little while, for a week or two, just to see if it makes a difference for them. So in addition to the potential irritation factor, a lot of people believe that either some chemical sunscreens or possibly all chemical sunscreens are acting as endocrine disruptors, and so that is something that is of increasing concern in general with regard to the cosmetics industry. And in addition, certain kinds of chemical sunscreens have been stated as being really problematic for coral reefs, and it may be the case that all chemical sunscreens are going to be turning out to be problematic for that as well. And then the fact that chemical sunscreens do actually penetrate the skin and that they are absorbed systemically, that also makes this concerning for some people, even if we're not talking about actual skin irritation. So it's seeming to me that whenever we have discussions about sunscreens, that it's really coming down to what we decide the lesser evil may be. Because it certainly is the case that sun is very damaging to skin, and that if you're not protecting yourself from the sun at all, then this can result in some real problems, including skin cancer. And so the real question is how to protect yourself from the sun without experiencing unacceptable levels of side effects. And which particular method of sun protection is chosen, I think, may vary a lot from person to person, depending on what their individual needs are and what their preferences are and their particular situation. Now, in terms of chemical sunscreens, there are 15 chemical sunscreens that are currently on the market in the U.S., and the FDA has expressed concern about all 15 of these, either because of the data that is already present or because there's not any data. And so they are supposedly still looking into this matter, but they don't really seem to be coming up with any good conclusions about it, simply because there is so little data. And it does seem to be the case that the extent to which particular sunscreens are perceived to be okay has varied a lot over time. So for instance, when I was a kid, then most of the sunscreens included ingredients like PABA or oxybenzone. And then more recently, octinoxate has become a popular ingredient, but that is increasingly thought to be potentially problematic too. Now there are more newer types of sunscreens which are both limited in terms of the kind of protection that they are providing, and it also is the case that they haven't been studied very much, which means that we may find out more problematic things about those particular ingredients as time goes on. So some of the sunscreens that are being used more popularly now, including octisalate, which is very similar to BOS, those have been cited as being potentially less problematic. But as I say, there's very little research on those. And it also, I think, is the case that these particular sunscreens are usually being used in combination with other sunscreens and products. So if that's the case, then it's really hard to know which sunscreen is causing irritation, if it is. And then, of course, a lot of sunscreens include other irritating ingredients in them, like fragrance. And so even if someone does experience irritation to a particular sunscreen, it's hard to know, for the most part, whether the irritant is the particular sunscreen like the octisalate or if it's something else. And the other thing that I want to point out about how research is done is that even if you have a study where you find that a particular sunscreen is not more likely to cause irritation than the placebo, that doesn't necessarily mean that people that are really sensitive to the sunscreen have participated in that study. Because I think that a lot of times people that are very sensitive just choose not to participate in that kind of research, and that certainly is not research that I would be participating in myself. Now, in terms of the mineral sunscreens, the zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, the issue with those is that in a lot of cases, the products that are present in sunscreens are the nano versions of them, the nanoparticles. And so those seem to operate a lot more like a chemical sunscreen in that they are not as chalky, they're not as white, they have a better texture, but there's also a question of whether or not they might be absorbed systemically. And if they are absorbed systemically, then there's a question of whether or not they can cause problems. So even though a lot of people think that these likely are pretty safe if they stay on the surface of the skin, whether or not they're actually staying on the surface of the skin is a big question. And then another way that nano zinc and nano titanium dioxide are similar to chemical sunscreens is that they are supposed to actually cause problems with coral reefs, maybe even worse than the chemical sunscreens. Now, if you have non-nano zinc and non-nano titanium dioxide, then that's supposed to be less problematic for the coral reefs. But whether or not it's entirely benign is not really proven either. Now, I haven't seen any evidence that nano zinc or nano titanium dioxide causes the same kind of endocrine effects that are suspected with chemical sunscreens, so that is a positive. Another potentially positive thing about using mineral sunscreens that are non-nano is that those may provide more benefit in terms of protection, especially from UVA, than the nano versions do, but that is not entirely clear. And the downsides, again, are that a lot of people don't like to wear sunscreens that include only non-nano mineral sunscreens because they tend to be sticky and white and unpleasant for some people. But despite the disadvantages of using mineral sunscreens without the nanoparticles in them, a lot of people are so concerned about this topic that many companies are making a point of stating that they don't include any nanoparticles in their mineral sunscreens. However, it also is the case that some of these same companies are putting Butyloctyl Salicylate or other kinds of unapproved chemical sunscreens in their products, and that customers really don't know about that at all from what I've been able to tell. Now, what I have found myself is that anytime I use any kind of product that it has an SPF in it, whether it's a foundation or an untinted sunscreen, that does cause some irritation to my facial skin. And in some cases, that irritation is really mild, and if I put on a good primer underneath it, that will pretty much eliminate the issue for me, at least if I wear that sunscreen only on occasion. But then in a lot of cases, products that are labeled as mineral sunscreens are causing me a whole lot of irritation, even though I'm not seeing any ingredients on the list that looks like it's going to be a problem for me. And that has made me really frustrated because it has really kept me from being comfortable buying any new sunscreen products or new SPF foundation products at all, because I fear that they are going to be irritating to my skin in a way that I can't circumvent by using a primer under them. Now, I do think it's the case that sun exposure increases the likelihood of skin cancer and premature aging, and so it is really important to me to protect my skin from the sun. On the other hand, one thing that we don't really talk about, especially in the YouTube beauty community, is the fact that skin irritation also leads to those same things, that there's a pretty strong literature that suggests that if your skin is irritated from whatever kinds of things, not just from sunburn, that this also leads to the increased likelihood of cancer and to the increased appearance of early skin aging. And then, of course, it's also the case that having a healthy skin barrier is a good protection against any kind of UV exposure. And so if my skin is irritated as a result of using a sunscreen, and that is allowing the UV rays to penetrate it more, then I really have not done myself any favors in using that particular product. And what I also find is that for me, skin irritation is a slippery slope. And so if I use a particular product and I say, well, I can go ahead and keep using this, it's only a little bit irritating, then what I almost always find out is that very soon other products become irritating, and then I really can't use anything. So what I have found the best thing for me to do with my skin is to adopt a zero tolerance policy with regard to not using any products that irritate my skin at all. And what I have found over the past couple years is that the more that I do this, the better that my skin is doing, both in terms of just not looking irritated, but also in terms of how healthy it is and lack of wrinkles. So all of that being the case, so far I have not found any sunscreens or SPF foundations that I feel comfortable using on a daily basis, but I have used quite a few other strategies to protect myself from the sun as much as I can. So what I believe is the most important thing for me in terms of protecting my facial skin from the sun is wearing an SPF 50 hat with a wide brim anytime I am in any kind of appreciable amount of sun, even if it's just going to be for a few moments. So this particular hat and most of the other sun hats in my very extensive collection are from a company called Sunday Afternoons, which is not a company that I have any kind of association with at all. I don't even have an affiliate link, but I am really loyal to this company because I think that the hats that they make have been really effective for me and really not too unattractive. So I started wearing this kind of hat when I was living in the Southwest out of my RV for a time and just traveling around. And what I found was that if I wore this kind of hat consistently anytime I was outside, that it protected my skin quite well, not just from any kind of burning, but from really getting any darker at all, despite the fact that the sun is very bright down in the Southwest. Now, there are certain circumstances where a hat like this would not protect you at all. So if you're skiing, for instance, most of the sun is going to be bouncing off snow, and sun can be very bright in the mountains, and so you need some other kind of protection then, especially. Or if you're boating, then you're going to be getting some reflection off the water. So, of course, there's no kind of sun protection that is going to be 100% effective, but I think that most people are really underestimating the extent to which a good hat can be protective for them. And generally speaking, regardless of where I've been here in the United States, I have found when I go to a place like the farmer's market on a really sunny day that really only about 1 in 10 people are wearing a hat at all, and I would say less than 1 in 100 people are wearing a hat that I consider to be really anything that's acceptable in terms of the amount of sun protection that it's giving. So I think people have a lot of room for improvement with regard to this particular means of sun protection. And then in addition, whenever I am out in the sun, I always am wearing sunglasses. Either the transition sunglasses that I wear all the time that become dark when I'm outside, or sunglasses like these, which are permanently dark and which I use primarily when I'm in the car. And I think that this is a really important means that also people are not necessarily doing as much as they should, because obviously sunscreen is not going to protect your eyes at all, and a hat like this is only protecting them to a certain extent. And sun exposure is really problematic when it comes to making your eyes more likely to get cataracts or to have other eye issues. And so for me, I would prefer to avoid any kind of surgery, including cataract surgery. And so also my eyes are just very irritated by bright light, so it's easy to remember. But I think this is another thing that people tend to not use as much as they should. And then in addition, I do walk my dog outside for at least an hour or two per day, so I do get a fair amount of exercise and I do get some exposure to daylight. But at least during the spring, summer, and fall months, I really am only doing that either really early in the morning or toward dusk. And I think that if I do that, then I'm really getting very little exposure to the really higher levels of UV light that are occurring during the midday hours. And in addition to that, I also am wearing a hat and my sunglasses. So in terms of being exposed to really bright sunlight, I'm really not getting very much of that. And I do try to limit the amount of time that I spend in the sun during the midday hours. I usually don't go out then at all, or if I do, I try really hard to really only stay in the shade. Now, of course, I live here in the upper Midwest, so I don't think that the UV light here is that strong as it is in certain other places, even in the middle of the summer. But if I do feel like I'm getting a lot of UV light, and if I have to go out during the daytime hours for more than a few minutes, then I will put on a sunscreen at that point. But I feel like this is something that I want to reserve for times when I'm really getting a lot of sun exposure, when I really need it. Another thing that I think is really important is that I don't use retinols, and I very rarely use any significant amount of hydroxy acids. So this is something that people seem to think is almost necessary for women as they get older, and people seem to think that it's kind of crazy for me not to be using those. But those things really do irritate my skin on their own, so I'm not interested in using them for that reason. And I also think that the idea of using a product that makes me more sensitive to the sun, when the sun is the thing that I think is likely the most damaging to my skin, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And even if I thought the retinol was going to make me look a little bit younger in the short term, the fact that it's making me more sensitive to the sun makes me not really interested in using it at all. Another thing that really very few people talk about is the question of whether a good diet can help you to protect yourself from the sun. And there seems to be a fair amount of evidence that that's actually the case, and that especially when we're talking about omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, that if you have more omega-3s and less omega-6s, that this can really help your skin to be protective from the sun. So for me, I really am not eating any kind of seed oils or any kind of very much omega-6 in my diet at all. And in addition, I'm eating a lot of pastured meats that have a higher ratio of omega-3s in them, and pastured butter and other pastured dairy products, and fish. I also eat very, very large amounts of local produce and organic produce, especially during the summer months when it is in season, and other kinds of antioxidants and polyphenols. And I think that those things also are very potentially helpful when it comes to protecting the skin from sun damage and from the sun in general. So these are all things that I have been doing really consistently over the past 15 years. And I will admit that I didn't get a whole lot of sun exposure when I was young either. I was much more interested in working and studying than I was hanging out at the beach when I was younger. And so that's probably helpful as well. But over the past 15 years, I've really just been trying to do things that felt good to me and felt like they were nourishing and helpful for my body rather than bad for my body. But if you look at what the real experts who know a lot about this field seem to be suggesting, it's really doing all of the things that I have been doing all along, and that the idea of using a multi-pronged approach to sun protection really seems to be where you're going to get the most benefit. Now, I do feel if I could find a sunscreen that worked for me and that provided me with a lot of skin protection and that wasn't irritating to my skin, and preferably one that was cosmetically elegant, I guess is what the word is, that wasn't going to be too white or chalky or yucky feeling, that would be something that I would be interested in using more often. So it's my hope that now that I've found out that there are some ingredients in supposedly mineral sunscreens that I know to avoid, that might allow me to experiment a little bit more and to try out more products that have a better chance of success, and maybe I will stumble upon some that will work better for me than the ones that I've used in the past. So when it comes to these sunscreen boosters that seem like they might be actually really chemical sunscreens, there's a whole list of them that are being used in that way and that we might be looking at. So BOS is the one that is receiving the most attention, and that is primarily because it's been used so often, but also because it's very similar to octisalate, but there are quite a few others as well. So the way that these unapproved chemical sunscreens get into sunscreen products is that once you have a product that has an approved sunscreen in it, like zinc oxide or one of the approved chemical sunscreens, then really, at least in the US, you can put whatever else you want into it. The government, the FDA, is really not interested or involved at all in trying to tell people that they shouldn't put any particular ingredients in the products. So if these companies want to, they can take a product that has an approved sunscreen in it, and then they can add a whole bunch of an unapproved sunscreen to it, and even have most of the sun protection come from the unapproved ingredients. And then the way that the actual SPF number is determined is just from practical testing. So they will take an individual and they will put some of the sunscreen with all of the ingredients in it on one part of the skin and then leave the other part uncovered, and then have there be exposure to UV radiation either outdoors or in the lab, and then they will see how long it takes each section to burn. And in order to be approved as a sunscreen in the US, it needs to be 15 times as long for the sunscreen part to burn as the other part. So if you put a lot of an unapproved sunscreen into one of these products, then you're going to get a much higher SPF because the burning time is going to take a lot longer. Or what you can also do is put in less of the mineral sunscreen and have the product be a more cosmetically elegant type of a formula that people are going to enjoy using more and give you better user ratings. And in general, what we will find, I think, is that especially if we're using non-nano mineral sunscreens, that you're going to have a very, very hard time getting a product that's an acceptable texture, especially for the face, that has a higher SPF than 30. This is really almost impossible to get. But on the other hand, if you surreptitiously add a lot of the BOS to it or some other kind of unapproved chemical sunscreen, then you can get that SPF number to go up a lot. So of course, if you add an ingredient like BOS into a product, then some people are going to be irritated by it. But if your goal is to get the majority of the population to like the sunscreen more and to have a more enjoyable usage with it, then maybe you're willing to allow that to be the case. Of course, some people at this point are going to say, well, if putting BOS or another sunscreen into the product helps the product to perform better and helps people to like it more and help people to wear it more, then that's a good thing and we should allow that to happen. And I absolutely think that if people want to use chemical sunscreens, that that's a perfectly fine thing. But what I also do think is that people that are trying to avoid chemical sunscreens should actually be allowed to have the information that they need to avoid them, and that they shouldn't be tricked into using a chemical sunscreen that they don't actually realize is a chemical sunscreen. So it's kind of hard to know how dangerous these unapproved chemical sunscreens are because there's no literature on them. And that is why, for instance, EWG is rating most of them as being a 1, not because they've been proven to be safe, but because they haven't been proven not to be safe. The most attention and the most concern seems to be for the ones that are very similar to octisalate. And those include not only BOS, but also one that is called Tridecyl Salicylate. And all three of those seem to be functionally the same in terms of the amount of sun protection that they are providing, and they seem to be very, very similar in terms of their chemical structure. And both BOS and Tridecyl Salicylate are both included in quite a few new sunscreen products that are currently on the market. So it seems when I've looked into this that in the past, at least some people did really believe that these ingredients that are sunscreen boosters were not really acting as chemical sunscreens and that they're actually just acting to improve the efficacy of the actual sunscreens that were in the products and that were approved for that purpose. So what people would say is that these help improve the spreadability of the product, or that people are using more of it because it's more, the formula is nicer. And I think that that might be the case, that people used to really believe that. But I think that the evidence at this point is pretty clear that that's not really the reason that these are making the SPF go up so much. So another question is that if these sunscreen boosters are actually chemical sunscreens, then why don't we just give them the status of being chemical sunscreens so that everyone's acting on the up and up? And of course, the issue with this is that it's very, very hard, especially in the US, but also in other countries, to get sunscreen ingredients approved. So you have to view them as being drugs, you have to do a whole lot of testing, and even for products that are pretty well established in other countries, such as ones in the EU, the FDA really seems to be very hesitant to approve any of them. So even if we wanted to say, well, Butyloctyl Salicylate is a great sunscreen and we want to get it approved, it would be very, very difficult to do that. So it's much easier to just throw it in to existing sunscreen formulas and increase the efficacy that way than to try to get it to be on the up and up. So if we look at EWG, the thing to know about them is that they will only rate an ingredient as problematic if there is some kind of scientific evidence to state that it actually is. And so in the case of most of these chemical sunscreens, including even some of the ones that have been approved and certainly the ones that have not been approved, there's really very, very little evidence to show whether these are safe. And particularly when we're talking about things like endocrine disruption, there's really not any good evidence at all one way or the other. But it is the case that there are suspicions that octisalate and BOS and Tridecyl Salicylate, that those all may be endocrine disruptors and that we just haven't figured out that is part of what is going on yet. Now, it's also the case that a lot of people seem to be reactive just to salicylates in general, and some people even think that salicylates in general may be endocrine disruptors. Now, what I have found myself is that I do think that salicylic acid is a little bit irritating to my skin. I always thought that that was because it's drying, but it's possible that maybe I'm reacting to salicylates in general rather than to just ones that are part of chemical sunscreens. I don't think that I'm reactive to things like aspirin or strawberries or other things that I take internally, so I'm not convinced that I'm really super reactive to salicylates in general, but it's possible that that could be one thing that's driving my reactions to the sunscreen with the BOS in it. In any case, if we're talking about octisalate, EWG does say that this one seems to be less problematic so far in terms of the evidence than many of the other chemical sunscreens that are out there, so they are currently rating that between a 3 and a 5 depending on the usage. In the past, for BOS, until about a year ago, they were rating that as totally without any problems associated with it at all. They were giving it a 1, not because there was data to show that it was safe, but because there wasn't any data to show that it was unsafe. At this point, they have changed it, and they are saying that it could be between a 1 and a 5, depending on the usage. And they are still not saying that there are any issues at all with regard to Tridecyl Salicylate or the other one that the Harvard researcher looked into, the Ethy Ferulate. But that again is not because they have any evidence that there isn't a problem, it's because there's no evidence that there is a problem. And then another source that a lot of people look at is Paula's Choice. And Paula's Choice is stating that BOS is functioning as a softening agent and a solvent, and that Tridecyl Salicylate is a softening ingredient for the skin. And Ethy Ferulate is stated as being an antioxidant and found in sunscreen formulas because of its role in thwarting UV damage. So that particular website does not seem to recognize the research from the Harvard people or the other speculation that these are actually really acting as chemical sunscreens. But as I say, this is early days. It's been only 6 months or so since that study came out. So I think that we can expect some of this to change as time goes on and as people become more interested in this issue. So another question that I've had is, if BOS is basically exactly the same as octisalate, then why is it that the manufacturers are not just using the octisalate and instead they're using the BOS in the product? And I think that one possibility is that, again, in the past, that some people actually did think that this was not a chemical sunscreen and that it was just helping the mineral sunscreens to perform better. On the other hand, I think it also may be the case that it is much more attractive to be able to say that your product is 100% mineral sunscreen, even though it has an unapproved chemical sunscreen in it, than to say that your product is a hybrid and that it has some chemical sunscreen in it, as well as the mineral ones. That people are not nearly as attracted to that because of so much of what we hear in the media that chemical sunscreens are bad and mineral sunscreens are better. So the latter, that is what the Harvard researchers suggest. And the term that they use in their paper is that the introduction of these unapproved chemical sunscreens into products is what they call doping. So if we think about sports doping, what that is using a performance-enhancing drug illicitly, so in a way that people don't know anything about, so that you can do better and then you try to keep people from knowing about it. And their suggestion is that that is what is happening here, that people know that if they admit that they're putting an unapproved chemical sunscreen in their products, then they will not be viewed as favorably, and so they are trying to keep this a little bit under the radar. So despite the fact that this is not being discussed too much openly, and despite the fact that it is really still under the radar, I did find a few articles that are aimed at the general population that do discuss this issue. So one of these is from a longtime science journalist. Her name is Anna Edney, and she has written about sunscreens and chemical sunscreen dangers for Bloomberg Business. And so she talked to a lot of credentialed sources that have interest in this particular issue, and some of those encouraged her to pursue the topic of sunscreen boosters. And then there's another person who's focused on this, is an Australian named Michelle Wong, who has a chemistry PhD from the University of Sydney, which is supposed to be a pretty good school. And she's now a full-time content creator focusing on various skincare issues with a blog and a YouTube channel. And she usually goes by the name of Lab Muffin. And by the way, this is not the same Michelle Wong who creates luxury beauty content and luxury fashion content for YouTube. So Lab Muffin seems to be really positive towards conventional cosmetics companies, and I really haven't seen her say anything that would go against their interests. And she does seem to be very, very negative towards clean beauty companies, and she often goes on what she self-describes as rants about how problematic they are in terms of their activities. So as you might expect, these two particular people had very different takeaways in terms of the issue that these sunscreen boosters might actually be unregulated chemical sunscreens. And what Lab Muffin's take is that if you've been using a mineral sunscreen and you find out that it actually has chemical sunscreen in it, then what you should do is conclude that chemical sunscreens aren't so bad after all, and maybe you should go ahead and try some of the ones that are approved. On the other hand, the position of the Businessweek reporter, Anna Edney, she seems to be taking the position that chemical sunscreens have a lot of potential problems associated with them, and that it might make sense to try to avoid them if possible, and that the ones that are in the mineral sunscreens that are not approved may not be really safe either, and that possibly it might be a good strategy to follow what some of her sources that are really credentialed have suggested, and that you might want to start wearing a better hat and spending more time in the shade. Now, my position on this is from the perspective of people who have sensitive skin. And if it indeed is the case that some of these sunscreen boosters are irritating to the skin, and you know about it, then you can choose to avoid those. But on the other hand, if people don't know that the sunscreen boosters are present and that they are causing irritation, and they think that the mineral sunscreens are just problematic for them in terms of unknown reasons, then they may not be willing to use mineral sunscreens at all. But on the other hand, if we can figure out which sunscreens actually are 100% mineral versus which ones are more like hybrids with unapproved sunscreens in them, then the people that do have sensitive skin have a better shot of being able to find sunscreens that are going to be appropriate for them, and then they will be able to use them. And that is what I'm hoping will happen with me. So despite these different conclusions, I am seeing some consensus on the idea that it really would be a good idea for people to know that some of these unapproved chemical sunscreens are being used in products that are currently being labeled as 100% mineral. So that seems to be the conclusion of Lab Muffin. It seems to be the conclusion of those Harvard researchers. It seems to be the conclusion with regard to that Businessweek reporter and her sources, and it seems to be my conclusion also, and I think that that makes common sense. And the only people that don't seem to be agreeing with that conclusion and who seem to be keeping this a secret on purpose seem to be people that are in the industry. Now, that is kind of a big accusation to suggest that these people are keeping that information secret on purpose, but I do think that based on one of the comments that's from the Businessweek article, I think that there may be some truth into that. So what she said was, while I was working on a Bloomberg Businessweek story about potentially dangerous ingredients in chemical sunscreens, someone in the industry suggested I also look at BOS. And this person doesn't want to be named for fear of professional reprisals. Now, there is one, I think, legitimate reason why people might not want to be talking about this too much. And I think that that is that you probably, if you're selling a product that has BOS in it, then you're probably may not be allowed to say, well, BOS is an unapproved chemical sunscreen and it's going to protect you from the sun, even though the FDA hasn't given approval for that. So that does make it a little bit challenging for any of these cosmetic companies or for a company like Credo to talk about this in a straightforward way. But on the other hand, if nobody's talking about it, then that makes it very difficult for consumers who do have skin issues to figure out what is going on with the products that they're using and how to choose a sunscreen that might be safe and effective for them. Now, in terms of where the cosmetic industry is right now, for instance, if we talk about Credo, now Credo is a retailer that focuses on clean beauty type products, quote unquote, and they state very clearly in their dirty guidelines that they do not allow any chemical sunscreens in their products. But on the other hand, it's my impression that Credo has been particularly proactive in terms of helping or encouraging companies that sell through Credo to put some of these sunscreen boosters in their products. So for instance, when I read an article about Venus Williams, who has a sunscreen line called 11, she said that she was concerned because she wanted to be able to use a clean sunscreen, but that the mineral ones were white on her dark skin, and that when she talked to Credo, they helped her to create a sunscreen that would work for her. And that sunscreen does have Tridecyl Salicylate in it, which is very similar to BOS. And when I read the interview with Venus Williams, she seemed to be suggesting that the sunscreen actually just was working better because the sunscreen boosters were making the formula smoother and easier to put on, and that was helping to increase the SPF. So she seemed to be honestly believing that, and maybe that's what has happened with some other companies as well. So when I wrote to Credo about this and I gave them a link to that Harvard article, what they wrote back to me was that we do allow what can be referred to as sunscreen boosters, as they can be an important ingredients to ensure a physical sunscreen is able to have a high UV protection, and there are not currently alternative boosters on the market that have more robust data. As you know, sunscreens are a vital over-the-counter drug to protect from UV damage and lower one's risk of skin cancers. So the people from Credo did tell me that they were going to pass on my letter and that article to their in-house scientists and impact team, but they certainly do not seem to be acknowledging at this point the idea that these particular ingredients actually are chemical sunscreens. Clean at Sephora really only prohibits a few particular chemical sunscreens, specifically benzophenones, oxybenzones, and octinoxate, so they don't seem to have a problem with any of the other sunscreens. So you may see things like octisalate or many other of the 15 sunscreens that are approved for use in the U.S. in those products, and they certainly can have all kinds of other stuff, including the unapproved chemical sunscreens as well. And I haven't found anything at all about sunscreen boosters from either EWG or Paula's Choice, but it is early days. Now, as I said, if you add either octisalate or BOS or Tridecyl Salicylate to a mineral sunscreen, then you may very well be able to get the SPF to go up from SPF 30 to SPF 50, and that will be really attractive to people. But the question that I have is whether or not that's actually really helpful in a practical way, or if it's just the illusion of helpfulness. So when we look at these studies, then they do have a good record of which kinds of UV rays have been addressed. And for a number of the sunscreens that are being used now, including octisalate and octinoxate, and also the BOS, and probably Tridecyl Salicylate also, what they are primarily doing is filtering UVB, and that is the kind of sun rays that are responsible for burning, and they are not doing anything at all really for UVA1, which is the kind of UV that is primarily responsible for skin aging, and it also seems to be the case that insofar as we're talking about melasma, that is mostly UVA1 related also. So if we have a mineral sunscreen like zinc oxide, then it is going to be doing a particularly good job of filtering against UVA1, as well as giving some protection against UVB. So it's keeping you from burning, but it's also preventing the kinds of radiation that go more deeply into the skin. And then if you add BOS or octinoxate or octisalate to it, then it is going to be providing additional protection against the burning, and so therefore that is the part of the sunscreen that is going to be affecting the SPF, and so therefore you are going to not have your skin be burning as much, and so therefore you're going to have a much higher SPF. And so the question is that what you're really looking for? Is the reason that you're wearing a sunscreen primarily to keep you the sun from burning your skin? So one thing that's important to understand here is that the ratio between the UVB and the UVA rays are not always consistent across situations, and that there are some situations where there are many, many more UVB rays than in other cases. So the times when you're likely to get a lot more UVB rays are times when you probably know by now that these are the times that you're most likely to get sunburned, which is when you are either closer to the equator, or it is the summer, or it is the middle of the day rather than in the evening or early morning hours, or when you are in the mountains. On the other hand, UVA radiation tends not to vary as much across situations. And it does also seem to be the case that for people who have darker skin, they are getting much more innate protection against UVB rays than they are against UVA. So even if people who have darker skin are not very concerned about getting sunburn and they haven't experienced much sunburn, they may nonetheless be concerned about the UVA rays that they're getting because, again, they may want to avoid getting skin cancer or melasma or premature aging. So we know here that if we have a regular zinc sunscreen that gives us SPF 30, that we're getting a broad spectrum of protection. We are being protected both from UVA and also to a certain extent from UVB. So then the question here is, do you want more UVB protection added to that in the form of BOS or some other kind of sunscreen? And if you are in a situation where you're getting an exorbitant amount of UVB radiation, then you may really welcome the addition of that extra UVB protection. On the other hand, if you're in a situation where you're not getting that much UVB exposure, or if you're a person that has darker skin, then you may not really need to have any more UVB protectant added to your sunscreen. And what you certainly don't want is to have some of the zinc oxide removed from the product and have a lot of BOS added to it that will jack up the SPF but not give you any more protection from the UVA exposure. So I think that that is a reason why it's really important for us to know what sunscreens are being included in the products that we use, both the approved sunscreens and the unapproved sunscreens. Because if we use a product that has a really high SPF, but it's not protecting us against the kind of UV radiation that we're really concerned about, then we can be really misled and end up with damage that we would prefer not to have. So I certainly am not saying that nobody should use BOS or that nobody should use octinoxate or octisalate, any of these UVB filters, but I do think that we really should have a better sense of how much protection we're getting from different kinds of UV radiation rather than just looking at that number and saying, well, an SPF 50 is much better than SPF 30, because maybe depending on what your goals are, maybe it's not any better at all. And then another finding that seems to be fairly robust is that when people have a sunscreen that has a higher SPF in it and they're getting more UVB protection, then they tend to be more cavalier about spending more time in the sun, and they actually tend to get more sun exposure, both because they think that they're getting protected because of that number, and then also if they don't get burnt, then they think, well, I'm doing okay, I don't really need to come in because I can get this much sun because the sunscreen is protecting me. So again, if what we're only concerned about is the burning, then that may make sense. But if what we're really concerned about is the underlying UVA radiation that's not burning you, then it may be really bad if you get more protection from a sunscreen that causes you to spend more time in the sun. So I'm reminded by all of this of my grandmother, who had a number of non-melanoma type skin cancers removed from her face, and that always perplexed me a bit because she almost never went in the sun. She had red hair and freckles and she tended to avoid it. But what I realized is that her sun exposure was because she was a florist. And so she spent a lot of time in the greenhouse. And the radiation that can come through the greenhouse windows is the UVA1 radiation, which is the one that's causing skin cancers and aging. And she did have a lot of wrinkles, but she wasn't getting burned because she was getting protected from the glass. So the glass was protecting her in the same way that these UVB sunscreens are protecting people now, even when they're outside. And I do think with my grandmother, if she had been burned every time she went out into the greenhouse, that likely she would have started wearing a hat when she was doing her work out there. So it's not always a good thing to get more UVB protection, and sometimes it can actually be misleading and make things worse. So I think that what we should all do is we should know what kind of sun protection we're getting and what our goals are, so we can choose the ones that are going to be most appropriate for our own particular needs. One more thing that I noticed in that Harvard study is that the rate of absorption of sunscreens, chemical sunscreens into the skin seems to have a lot to do with how long the sunscreens are left on the skin, and that the longer that the sunscreens are left on the skin, the higher the absorption rate is going to be. And that at some point, if we get to like 12 hours, then it goes way up in a lot of cases. And that's especially the case if your skin already is damaged or irritated. So my takeaway from that is that even if my skin were not being irritated by chemical sunscreens and I wanted to use them on occasion, that it probably would be a good idea for me to put on the chemical sunscreen just right before my sun exposure was going to occur, and then to take it off right after the sun exposure so that as little of the product would be absorbed into my system as possible, and therefore if there are any negative effects such as endocrine disruption, that would be at least less likely to occur. And I think that this is really different from what I see most people, especially here on YouTube, suggesting, which is that every day you should use some kind of a sunscreen, and they're usually not differentiating between a mineral one and a chemical one. You should put the sunscreen on first thing in the morning and use it every single day, including when you're not planning to go outside or when the UV radiation level is really low, just so you get into the habit of it. And I think that this get into the habit of it could be an acceptable approach if you're using a mineral sunscreen and if you think that there's no hazards at all in putting the chemical sunscreens on your skin. But if you think that there's any hazard at all, or that there could be in putting chemical sunscreens on your skin, then I think that it's probably a good strategy to minimize the amount of time that they're on the skin so that the absorption is not as high into your system. And if you already have skin that's irritated, then this seems like an even more important strategy to pursue, because the more irritated your skin is, the more of this sunscreen is likely to actually be absorbed. Now, a final question that I have is why this BB Burst is not labeled as a sunscreen. And I think it's obviously the case that it takes a lot of money and effort to put a sunscreen on the market. So you have to actually do that testing, see what the SPF is, apply for it. So if you want to bring a product to market, then it's going to cost an awfully lot more to bring the same product to market if you want it to be labeled as a sunscreen. Now with Kosas, they previously introduced this Revealer foundation, which is labeled as a mineral sunscreen, but that has one of those sunscreen boosters, a different one in it also. And they probably, from what I've seen, I saw very few people using this product because it was a sunscreen. They seem to be a lot of people that really liked the way it looked, the way that it felt on their skin, the way that it performed, but I'm not sure how much of that had to do with the sunscreen benefits of it. So one thing that I have learned since focusing more on the beauty industry is that most products are not ones that the people at the cosmetic companies say, oh, I would like to make this foundation, and then they'd go to a formulator and say, can you please do that? It seems to go the opposite way most of the time, that people from beauty companies will go to the factories where the formulators work, and they will be presented with some products, and they will try them out and see if they like them. And then if they do like them, then they will go ahead and purchase them and sell them. And so I kind of don't think with the case of this BB Burst that what they did was to say, let's make a sunscreen and then not label it. I think it's more that they went shopping and they found this product and they thought, this is really a great product. What a great job they did creating a product that's really pretty and hydrating and nice on the skin. So let's go ahead and buy this and sell it. But I don't think that we need to spend all that extra money to put an SPF on it, because that's not going to really matter to people anyway. They're just going to buy it because it's a nice foundation. So that's my guess with regard to what happened to this. I'm not absolutely sure that that's the case. Now, I do think that there are a few hints with this product that it might be a sunscreen, so the use of the yellows and the blues on it are a hint. I think the fact that they use that term BB on here, I think that this is supposed to be beauty balm, but really almost all the time, if I look up products that are called BB, they always have sunscreen in them. So I think that what they may be doing is trying to give hints that this is a sunscreen, even though they're not actually coming out and saying it. So I spent a lot of time looking at a whole lot of both SPF foundations and sunscreens in order to pick out a few that I think are possibilities. Now remember that I don't talk at all about products that have other problematic ingredients on this channel, so none of these sunscreens that I'll mention have any parabens in them, none of them have any synthetic fragrances in them, and most of the ones on these lists are higher end possibilities, not necessarily because I'm determined that I'm only going to review luxury and high-end products, but because what I tend to find is that most of the time drugstore type products tend to have parabens or fragrance or other problematic ingredients in them that I know I can't tolerate. So on the first page here we have a collection of mineral SPF products that don't have any sunscreen boosters in them that I'm aware of. Now it may be the case that the list of sunscreen boosters that I have is incomplete and that there are some sunscreen boosters that are in these products that I'm not aware of and that haven't been identified yet by the people who seem to be looking at these issues. But of the sunscreen boosters that were listed, for instance, by the Business Week reporter and the Harvard people and the Lab Muffin, the ones that are on this list don't have those in it. So I've tried a few of the products on here and I've done YouTube reviews on them, and compared to all of the SPF foundations that I've used, these have all been fairly good for me. So I'm talking here about the Say Slip Tint, the Han Cosmetics one, the Bare Minerals, for instance, the Complexion Rescue one, and the Honest Beauty one. The Jane Iredale ones, I discussed those in my Jane Iredale video. One of those has some essential oils and fragrances in it, and I do find that often I do react to natural fragrances, and so I try to avoid a lot of those a lot of the time. And that's the case with the Beauty Counter one also, that one has a lot of natural fragrances in it, and so that one hasn't been as good for me. So again, I haven't found that any of these have been 100% not irritating for me, but I have found that the ones that I've done the reviews on, that if I put down a good primer under them, I can usually tolerate them, at least on an occasional basis when I actually need them to protect myself against particular large amounts of sun. So now I'm feeling confident enough that these kinds of sunscreens might have a chance of being workable for me and that it might be worth trying a few more of these. So I'm kind of thinking about the Iris and Romeo one, for instance, and probably the Suntegrity one. But if you haven't tried any of these and they've worked for you, then I would be really interested in that, since that would give me a good sense of which ones to try next. Now, the next couple pages are sunscreens that do not include any sunscreen boosters that I know of, and I'm interested again in having people who have tried some of these products let me know how they worked for you, since I would now like to try a few more of these and to see if I can get any to work. And then next we have a page of foundations that do have Butyloctyl Salicylate or BOS in them, and there's some familiar names here, and these are ones that I did find to be especially irritating and that I decided not to use almost immediately after trying them. So I'm talking about the Tower 28 one, the Ilia one, the Well People one, and then there's a few other newer products that I haven't tried but that I've been a little bit suspicious about, including the new Ciele products and the Supergoop products. And of course all of these are listed as being clean at Sephora, and they are all listed as being mineral sunscreens. And of course they are mineral sunscreens. They do have zinc oxide in them, but that is not necessarily all that they are. I think it's interesting how many products Ilia has put BOS in, including some of their eyeshadow palettes. I'm not quite sure why they put that product in so many of their cosmetic products, even when they're not supposed to be sun protective, but they kind of did go a little bit wild using that ingredient. I've really not seen that ingredient used in anything else that's not supposed to be sun protective, except of course the Kosas BB Burst product. And then on the next page, we have some untinted mineral sunscreens that do have BOS in them. There's no shortage of these. I've found quite a lot of them. I would say that most of the drugstore type foundations that claim to be mineral sunscreen, that they do have BOS in them, and that many of the clean beauty ones also do. Even Beauty Counter, which has been a leader in the clean beauty movement, does have a BOS in one of its sunscreens, mineral sunscreen that has a foaming type of an action that's designed for use on the body. And I did buy that one, and I did find it to be perplexingly irritating and felt suspicious in terms of how I felt about it from an intuitive point of view. So now I kind of understand why that is. And then next we have a list of some sunscreen companies that Anna Edney from Business Week and Lab Muffin have said have used BOS in their sunscreens. Now these are sunscreens that may or very likely do have either parabens or fragrance in them, so I have not included products from these companies on my list, and some of them are also from Australia, where Lab Muffin is from. So I have not looked up the individual sunscreens here, but there are a lot of companies that are selling mineral sunscreens that do have BOS in them. Now the next page is the Tridecyl Salicylate. So this is the other chemical that is very similar to BOS and that is similar to octosalate. So there are several newer companies here that are selling products that have that particular ingredient in them, including, for instance, this is the Venus Williams sunscreen line. And I don't think that I have ever tried a sunscreen with this particular ingredient in it. And since it's said to be very, very similar to BOS, I suspect that I would react the same way to it that I did to BOS. At some point, if I can get a tiny little sample of one of these products, maybe I will give it a try. But my guess is this is not going to be a good product for me. And then on the next page, we have products with Ethy Ferulate in them. And this is the other sunscreen booster that the Harvard researchers looked at in their study and that they say is an octinoxate analog. And this is a product that actually is in the Kosas Revealer foundation, which I have used quite a few times. So I have found that, as with other mineral sunscreens, that this one has been a little irritating to me, but that if I put it on over a primer, I usually do okay with it, and so I do use it on occasion. I have found this to be a good performing foundation in terms of it looking nice on my skin, in terms of it not emphasizing my wrinkles, so that is kind of why I have decided to use it. But my conclusion from this is either that I am not reactive too much to ethyl ferulate, or I have not yet become reactive to it, or that they're using a very small amount of it in this particular product. And I'm not sure which one it is, but I guess that so far I feel a little bit less suspicious about ethyl ferulate. I'm not real big on avoiding things based on a theory. I tend to much more avoid things based on how my skin or how my body reacts to those things or how I feel about it from an intuitive point of view. I don't feel that bad about using this particular product, so I may continue to go ahead and use it in the future, but I think that I'm more interested in trying some new mineral sunscreens or mineral SPF foundations to see if I can find ones that are not irritating for me at all. And then another sunscreen booster that is suspected as being a chemical sunscreen by at least some people, including Lab Muffin, is DESM. And in this list, there's only one SPF product that's listed, and I haven't tried that one. I have used the Tarte Gloss and the Westmont Atelier Powder Bronzer. I wouldn't say that I felt great about either of those products, but I haven't found them to be irritating. So I don't know about this particular one, but this is not a particular sunscreen booster that seems to be used very often. So in general, I was disappointed that I wasn't able to use that Kosas BB Burst product because I think it could be a nice product if I were able to tolerate it, and because I do like a lot of the Kosas products. But on the other hand, I do think that this experience has caused me to find out a lot more about this particular topic, and that I have a much better chance at this point of finding some sunscreens that actually do work for me and that I will be able to use in the future now that I have a better idea of what's going on. So I'm not sorry for that reason, and I think that what I will do is try some more of these products and see if I can find some, and then I will let you know in some future videos how I do with that. So thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of the video. And if you have had any good experiences with any sunscreens or any SPF foundations, then I hope you will share that information in the comments, because I am definitely looking for some new products to try, and I think some other people might be interested in that as well. In addition, if you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, then I hope you will go ahead and do that. And Coco and I love you very much, so thank you very much for watching. Goodbye. Ba-da-ba-da-da-ba, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da.